There are 5 questions about history: who, what, where, when, and why. And of all these 5, why should be the one that you should care the most. You can easily find information about who, what, and where. But why is a very powerful question because it asks you to analyze, to look for the reasons for why things are the way they are today.
There is hope for Ukraine to win Russia.
Of course there is a hope. Strategically, Ukraine already won this war. It's now the question is, what will be on the grounds the victory look like? Ukraine and Russia, that any possibility of that union is long gone.
Who are you?
That's quite an introduction. I'm Alex. I'm a historian by trade, and I research revolutionary era.
Revolutionary era. What does that mean?
It means part of European, one can say, world history that was affected by the revolutions that began in the second half of the 18th century. So in France, in the Americas, in Haiti, and elsewhere.
And you specialized on a couple of topics. When I researched you, you specialized on Napoleon, you specialized on Russian history as well, right?
That's right. So revolutionary era is the chronologically from 1750 to 1850. But within that era, I liked French history. I like Russian history, history of the Middle East, kind of looking broadly how the revolutions that began in the second half of the 18th century affected the world. So,
and what is all this connected when you research and study the history of Napoleon Wars and the history of Russian wars at that time? Do you find a lot of intersection between all of them?
Of course. Russia was an active participant in the Napoleonic Wars. And, you know, in my own book, I've argued that Napoleonic Wars are not just a European phenomenon. So this is not just a war that affected Europe. This is a war that affected the world. So you see the effects of it in faraway places like China, like Japan, like South America or South Africa. So it's a conflict of global dimension. In the European squabbles, you know, the squabbles between these great powers like France, like Russia, Britain, Austria. Well, those squabbles have ramifications and impact well outside the borders of Europe. And that's the subject I'm particularly interested in, to see how this period shaped not just Europe, but the rest of the world.
How?
One way, let me give you a good example, would be when Napoleon took over the Spanish monarchy in 1808, that had a direct impact on the Spanish Empire, colonial empire. Your listeners probably are aware of the Spanish conquest of the Americas in the 16th century, right? The emergence of the Spanish colonial empire. Well, what do you do if you live in the colonies? Let's say modern day Mexico or today's Argentina or Chile and Bolivia, right? These countries didn't exist back then. They were colonial territories of Spain. But what do you do as a resident of these colonies when you hear that your king has been detained or overthrown by a foreign power? Do you stay loyal to him and fight for his return? Do you support somebody else that the foreign power put on the throne of Spain? Or do you say, screw both of them and let's do something else? Let's find our own way. And so here you have, therefore, this impact, right? Napoleon's decision to take over Spain has a direct outcome or impact on places like Mexico or Argentina, where they have to make a decision. Do they want to stay under this Spanish control if Spain is controlled in turn by Napoleon? So in Argentina, for example, in what is today Argentina, what was back then the province of Rio de la Plata, the decision was made to seek independence. That's a profound decision, right? That shapes the history of South America, certainly the people who live in what is today Argentina. But you see, for example, different outcome or different conclusion made in places like Chile or Venezuela, where Some people wanted to stay loyal to Bourbon rulers of Spain and actually fight for their restoration, and some who wanted independence. So you have this long conflict that begins between the loyalists and the patriots, that will continue for a better part of 15 years until early 1820s, when finally you see the collapse of the Spanish Empire and the emergence of kind of modern Latin American states. Or think about the impact on of Napoleonic or Revolutionary era as a whole, and Napoleonic Wars on India. Right, the British conquest of India accelerates. It started before, but it really accelerated during Napoleonic era, and you see the British East India Company forces, right, conquering parts of India as part of this global struggle against the French interests. Right, they want to deny the French any presence in India, and in order to deny, they have to force the local states to choose. They either with the British or they're considered an enemy. And so we see invasion of Mysore, we see the forcing of the states like Hyderabad to follow, to listen to the British, or the defeat of Marathas. And ultimately by 1815, that will lead to the creation of the British imperial domain in India, famously the British Raj. And so we can talk about events like this in many other parts of the world.
So all this that you said is basically an explanation on how those wars and like Napoleon overstating the government, all this stuff affected the world and shaped the world that we are living now fundamentally.
That's right.
If that didn't happen, then probably we're not going to have Mexico as we know it.
That's right. The history would have developed a different way, right? Now, where are you originally from?
I am from Cyprus.
Cyprus. I assume you consider yourself of Greek origin.
Correct.
Right? So Greece, modern history of Greece starts in this revolutionary era. Right? Think about the Greek rebellion of 1820, right? 1821. It is one of the fundamental causes of the Greek rebellion is what is happening in Europe. It's the impact of the French revolutionary ideology, it's the impact of Napoleon, and so on.
Against the Turks, you mean, the 1981.
That's right. So 1821, not 19. 1921 is the Greco-Turkish War. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm talking about the Great Rebellion that began in 1821 that leads to the Greek War of Independence, or Greek Revolution, if you want to prefer to call it that way, a decade-long struggle, right? But that struggle will not be, would not have succeeded, would not have taken place if we don't consider what preceded it, and what it's almost 25 years of revolutionary upheaval in Europe. The way the great powers positioned themselves during the great Greek revolt of 1821 is the directly relevant or directly representative of the situation that was taking place during Napoleonic Wars. So that's an important, a way to look at it. Of course, things would have happened, but they would have happened differently, and the outcome of those historical developments would have been different without French Revolution, without Napoleon.
Wow, interesting. So basically, it's all of the countries probably around Europe, they drew an inspiration from these things. And they said, why for me to not have an independent country, or for me to not rule ourselves? So you are saying it's kind of a domino effect across all Europe.
Yes, you can say that. Especially Napoleon is very successful at waging wars, right? He's very capable military leader. And he has a period when his military supremacy is virtually unmatched. So starting in 1800 until 1809, he's undefeated, right? He wins every war that he fights. So we see the Austrian defeat in 1801, then a coalition of European powers defeated in 1805, another coalition defeated in 1806, yet another one in 1807, then another one in 1809. So if there is a power that is so dominant that it can defeat almost united force of Europe, inevitably there will be consequences of that. Consequences, for example, for Germany, where Napoleon takes control of Central Europe, takes control of what is today Germany. Of course, back then there was no Germany as such. Instead, you have over 300 Germanys. And so Napoleon looks at this and tries to reorganize it and create something more manageable, at least in his mind. And so he takes this medieval construct of hundreds of German states and reduces that to only 36. That's enormous change, isn't it? To go from 300 plus or over 330 different polities, states, free cities, kingdoms, bishoprics, right, duchies, and to reduce it to only 36, right? Another way we can look at it is this: if there is a power that is so dominant, then at what certain point, after being defeated 2, 3, 4, 5 times, you're going to ask yourself, why am I losing these wars, right? Why is it that these guys are winning? And once you ask that question, you'll start digging, trying to analyze the mistakes, trying to understand the reasons for the success of your enemy. And as you do that, you will try to learn. And learning usually means seeing how they do things and then borrowing. And so what we see is that Napoleonic success forces other powers to adjust, to improve, to become better at things. And in this case, better at fighting, better at organizing war, military. And that will then have a direct impact for the rest of the century, because European powers emerge out of this period better prepared for managing wars, raising resources, mobilizing manpower, which is crucial to understanding how Europe becomes so dominant in the later half of the 19th century, right? Europe becomes an imperial power of global magnitude.
I think you raised a question for all of us that needs to be answered. Why they were so successful?
You mean why Napoleon was so successful?
Yeah. And everyone was trying to identify and learn from their success.
Sure. There are several reasons for it. I mean, not several, many reasons for it. So, and I don't think we even have enough time to touch most of them. But of course, the legacy of French Revolution is an important one. The revolution was about creating a new society, a new governance, a society that will be based on equality before the law, a greater equality in terms of taxation, the natural rights, right? And so it casts about kind of a vision of a society that is quite modern, right? We take many things today for granted. We take for granted that most of us live in a constitutional system that guarantees our rights and freedoms, that we have these basic notions of natural rights, that we are born with them and we are endowed with them and we continue to live and enjoy them. But that was not always the situation, right? It's a recent phenomenon, historically speaking. Another way to look at it is that, especially from a military point of view, is that both revolution by smashing the old system, the old way of life, and Napoleon by creating something fundamentally symbiotic and borrowing, cherry-picking parts that he believed are the best, creates a very efficient state machinery. So we oftentimes refer to Napoleon as the founder of the modern state, in both in a bad way and a good way. So, for example, in a bad way, that Napoleon creates a police surveillance system that was previously would have been unheard of, right? A massive police surveillance that is controlling and surveying the citizens. But on the good side of it, Napoleon also is the man who gives us, for example, national systems for vaccination, right? Or Napoleon is the one who, on one hand, creates kind of dictatorial power. He is, in many respects, a military dictator. He certainly comes to power as such. But on the other hand, he introduces administrative, economic, and financial reforms that ultimately benefit benefit France. In fact, if you look at the very foundations of the modern French state, right, what today France is, virtually every element of French statehood has been shaped by Napoleon, from its administration to its banking, to its economy, to its tax system, to its laws, right? And many of those reforms have a knockoff effect on other parts of Europe and the world, partly because Napoleon was able to occupy those territories and bring about change, and partly because those regions, all countries, saw that that parts of this system, part of what the French were doing, were better than theirs, but more efficient, and they were willing to borrow and adopt.
Where he drew inspiration, you think? Because we are, as humans, it's not that we are enlightened and we come up with all the knowledge ourselves. We probably saw it somewhere, this stuff, or read somewhere. Where you think it was his inspirations?
Napoleon was a very astute student of history. He read voraciously, both as a child and later on. You can go through his correspondence and you see his efforts to create his personal library that will have thousands of books, and every year he purchases hundreds of books to add to it in order for him to stay in touch on what's most recent. So that's one of the important kind of ways to look at it. That is self-edification process, right? Napoleon went and received good education, military education, but certainly a good education in those military schools. But he remained an autodidact for the rest of his life. He read, he understood, he analyzed. But of course, it's the type of literature that he read that is also important to consider, right? Because you can be reading yellow kind of press fiction and kind of fluffy romantic novellas. That's one thing. But reading philosophical works, reading the works of the scholars who are analyzing economy or military, that's a completely different category, right? Or different kind of level of reading. And Napoleon did that. He was the child of enlightenment. He was raised on these notions of rational thinking, skeptical mind. He read voraciously the writings of the European philosophers, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Locke, right? You name it. But then he's also the child of French Revolution, that many of the things that he did are not necessarily things that he invented, but rather things that he saw already started during the Revolution, but the Revolution was unable to finish. And that's where he comes as the decision maker, the man who can enforce his will and bring about the change. Because it is one thing to start the change, right? We all have ideas, but unless we act upon those ideas are meaningless. And so Napoleon is not necessarily the ideas man. What he is a very good in terms of carrying out, fulfilling those ideas. And so his reforms are inspired, initiated by revolution, but he brings them to conclusion. And so that's where his role, really historical role, is as a person who brings revolution to a certain conclusion. Right? It's not necessarily, again, in history, very rarely do you have this kind of black and white, right? History is full of if you look at the spectrum, right, kind of light, you see kind of stretching and the light kind of blends one color to another. Well, that's how history is. And Napoleon is on the spectrum, both as a bad guy, because he did a lot of things that should make us uncomfortable today, like, for example, restoration of slavery. But he also did a lot of things that were progressive for its time. Right? Napoleonic Code, which was developed and established by him, but based on the revolutionary legacy, right? That code was among the most progressive legal codes of the 19th century. It was far ahead of the legal system of other European countries, which is one of the reasons why so many countries actually borrowed and adjusted to their needs. So for Napoleon, both receives good education, makes sure that he remains a student, right? Kind of a desire to read, to understand. And then another element that I'll add is that he's a good judge of people. He's good and a very astute observer of people, and he surrounds himself with capable people, right? Men that know their stuff. Right? Even to give you an idea, to the degree that even when he knows that some of those people betray him, he's still willing to employ them because he appreciates their skills. He appreciates what they bring to the government, to the decision making.
How does everyday life look back then at that age of the common people? There is libraries. Like, where do they have schools? Do they die at 40? Like, how does everyday life look?
Well, let me kind of maybe ask you where. Because that is a very important point to clarify. If you had a time machine, I don't know if you're a sci-fi fan. If you find a blue telephone booth and decide to use TARDIS to time travel, it does matter where you're going to end up. Because your experience of life in southern Italy will be dramatically different from experience of life in northern Italy. I'm not even talking about difference from one country to another, even within one country. Being born a peasant in a rural area would have caused you to experience life differently from being born a son of a merchant or a banker or a nobleman who has wherewithal to pursue their happiness, right? To use that Jeffersonian expression. In that sense, it's not that much different today, right? It does matter where you are born. It does matter what socioeconomic status your family has. Broadly speaking, if you look at France, right? Revolution significantly improved the quality of life for most people because it brought about a system that was based on equality before the law, that did reorganize the previous or kind of old system in which you could have been arrested on arbitrary kind of pretense, where you had no presumption of innocence. Again, one of those things that we take for granted, right? Habeas corpus, this notion that if you're arrested, the prosecution has to prove your guilt. Well, in France, it wasn't like that, or in other parts of Europe, it wasn't like that until this revolutionary era, when presumption of innocence becomes the principle of law. Napoleon plays a very important role in laying the foundation for French educational system. In fact, to the present day, where every French student finishing high school has to pass the test that Napoleon created, the infamous BAC system, which has been around for the past 200 years. Similar impact, not necessarily directly by Napoleon, but certainly because of Napoleon, you see in German states, and for example, especially in what then was Prussia, what is today, right, northern Germany, where Prussia was militarily defeated by Napoleon in 1806, and it's one of the greatest kind of military catastrophes of this period. Well, the Prussian response to it was to reevaluate what they have, why they have it, right? Does it make sense? Because we just lost a major war against a foreign power. Does our system, does the way we do things make sense? And they started the era of the great reforms. And over the next decade, they really rebuild their system, including education. So that's where this is a period that is quite exciting because of the scale of change that they bring. Some of this change improve human experience of life, some doesn't. I told you the good stuff, right? But on the more negative note, one of the crucial impacts of this period is that state becomes more powerful. It becomes more intrusive. That's one of the legacies of Napoleon, that state takes a greater role in everyday life, and especially when it comes to military, right? So, for example, France was the first nation to establish modern-style conscription, where young men have to register for military service, and then the state comes and grabs them and drags them to war, right? So that system then was kind of borrowed in parts or whole by other European powers because they understood how advantageous it is to have a system that recruits and mobilizes hundreds of thousands of young men for the service. Okay, so it is up to you to decide whether that is a good or a bad thing, right?
So back then, what was the transportation? It was still we had like trains. Did we have like
trains have not been made yet? Well, let me rephrase it. The first train that we can call it as such, although it had the wonderful name of rocket, was actually tested in 1804. So during this period. But trains will not have an impact until 1820s. So the first commercial train line opens in mid-1820s. And even then, it is a largely British innovation. So it will only make slowly impact on the rest of Europe in 1840s, 50s, and then slowly to the rest of the world. No, the primary mode of transportation is horses. Horses and carriages. Depending on how you travel, so from Paris, for example, from Paris to travel to Marseille, so from Paris all the way down to Mediterranean Sea, if the weather cooperates, it usually took them about a week.
So all the wars Napoleon fought, it was on horses.
That's right, horse and carriages. That's right. Well, in that sense, here's the thing. Usually we forget that even during World War II, right? So this is 1940s. Even during World War II, a lot of transportation was done through horses and carriages and transports. That's right. You look up at even German transportation or Polish transportation during the early parts of World War II, and you'll see that mechanization, is present. Of course, trucks are there, but horses are still around. You're certainly old enough to remember American invasion of Afghanistan, and you know that even during that invasion, American special forces relied on horses rather than cars and or mechanized transportation. So horses will be around for a while.
Wow. Wow. So back to the everyday life. Let's say on France, it was banking system. The people they never left their village. They were not aware of what is happening in the war. Generally.
No, the world is far more modern than you probably expect. France has a robust printing press. In fact, during the Revolution, you had hundreds of newspapers and journals. Napoleon, however, and this is where his kind of modern state approach, you see, Napoleon was suspicious of free press. So therefore, when he came to power, he reduced the number of newspapers gradually from several dozen down to just 4 and ultimately just 2, because he wanted to control free media. But newspapers are present and they are in circulation. The better question to ask is the literacy rate. And the literacy rate by modern day standards is low, but still. So in cities, about 2/3 of people could read and write. In the provinces, the literacy rate, right, the ability to read and write was far lower, so usually about 1/3 of people could do that. So that would have, of course, shaped whether you followed events or not. But even then, if you can't read, you probably can go to a local tavern, grab a pint of beer, and sit and listen to what others are talking about or what others are reading, right? And oftentimes you have this public debates and discussions of the news. In terms of banking, no, banking system has been around for quite some time. The Medici family in Italy, of course, is among the pioneers of banking in Europe. And if you look broadly outside Europe, you can trace the origins of the banking to the Middle East, to the development, for example, of early banking in Egypt in the 9th, 10th century. So banking has been around for quite some time. What has not been around, and what is unique, for example, for this period, is development of a national system of banking, where you have many, kind of local branches, regional, banks, but then you also have a national bank that controls and supervises the financial sector as a whole. Now, that is a unique for France, and Napoleon establishes Bank of France almost as soon as he comes to power, and that Bank of France survives to the present day. Another interesting kind of vision that he has is a vision that one of the kind of goals of his conquests, right, is the vision to create what we sometimes refer to as kind of universal empire, and that is to unite Europe under a French leadership, and which would have given the continent a single government, single currency, and single set of laws. So just think about what European Union is today, and now you can add to it a far greater political integration, and that was Napoleon's vision. And of course, that union of Europe would have been subservient to French interests. If you read his letters, he always places France above every other nation. He believes that France is superior to the other nations. He believes the French culture is superior, and the French way of doing things is better. French laws are better. He's convinced, therefore, wherever he goes, right, he brings this French intervention, French way of doing things. But ultimately, what he wanted is to create an imperial space in Europe where French laws, French government, French currency, French culture would have been dominant. A form of European Union, but certainly a francophone and French controlled.
So he was thinking that our state is the best state, so by conquering other states, we do them good.
Oh, absolutely. There is a famous scene in 1806 when one of his marshals goes into German state he enters the city of Kassel and issues a manifesto where he says, don't worry, we are here to improve the things that you have, right? Essentially tells them, your system sucks, it's not good enough, and we're here to improve. Mm-hmm. There is absolute sense of superiority that the French have.
So back then, how does the communication, how did Greece got inspired to do these things? How does Mexico get inspired? Do they hear it in a newspaper? They write about Napoleonic Wars? How does the message spreads across the world?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes, there is a very robust transatlantic communication, right? Ships are sailing on daily basis back and forth, and the news are spreading faster than you probably think. It's certainly not on the modern day kind of scale where you can learn the news that happened on the other side of the globe in a matter of minutes. But here we talk about more of a matter of weeks. So when Napoleon invades Spain and takes over the monarchy, well, a couple of weeks later, the news reaches the colonies and it has a response. It's done through people who are on the ships, right? They come and kind of share the news, but they also are done through newspapers that these ships are carrying. And once these newspapers reach and kind of are accessible to the colonial authorities, they then print their own newspapers and share the news that way. In fact, in my book, I talk about a phenomenon that we think is modern, but actually is not, and that is the phenomenon of fake news. So, for example, colonial officials constantly complain about the spreading of what they called false news, fake news, because there were so many rumors that were floating around about this or that, and the governments, both in Europe and in the colonies, were actually trying to make sure that these false information, or what they perceived to be false information, was not affecting the public opinion. But just as we've struggled to contain it, they did too, because there are different ways to circumvent the censorship, different ways to circumvent government restriction. You can print pamphlets in a different country and then smuggle them in. And so that becomes this kind of constant refrain in almost every government's correspondence.
That's interesting. As you mentioned before, Napoleon did only left only 2 newspapers, so it's easy to spread fake news with only 2 newspapers.
You know, that is not fake news, my friend. That's propaganda.
Yes.
Fake news is when they do it to you. When you do it, it's propaganda. So no, of course he did. The newspaper that one of the official newspaper that he keeps around, for example, is Le Moniteur Universel. Copies of it, all digitized, you can read online. You can see that that newspaper publishes select pieces of news from all across Europe, but they all serve the purpose. And the purpose is to show how awesome the French government is and how the other side is bad. Same applies for British, same applies for Russian or Spanish newspapers, right? Those are newspapers who are serving particular purpose. And that is to justify the government's existence, to justify the government policies, and to portray the other side as you know, untrustworthy, conniving, or worse.
What was the main motive of wars back then?
That's a bit. It's both an easy question and a complex question. Easy because you are probably tempted to say good old territorial expansion, right? And in some respects, that's true. Both the wars that Napoleon waged and the wars that were waged by other great powers are wars of territorial expansion. So they are bent on expanding territory, and through that, they're expanding their power, they're expanding the resource base that is at their disposal, and therefore they become stronger. So, for example, in Russia, during this period, Russia is expanding very rapidly. At this time, the Russian Empire took over Finland, took over almost all of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was one of the largest states in Europe, stretching from Baltic Sea almost to the Black Seas, right? So that is destroyed, and Russia is main beneficiary. It is at this time that Russia takes over what is today southern Ukraine and Bessarabia or Moldova. It is during this time that Russia expands into Caucasus, takes over my own homeland, Georgia, right? Not to mention the subsequent expansion into Asia. So territorial expansion is absolutely, it's a power grab. But there's an other aspect to it that is also kind of equally, if you ask me, equally important, and that is genuine belief that their way of doing things is better. And so there's a term for it. A French term is a mission civilisatrice, a civilizing mission. This is what French are doing in Europe, right? When they go and they tell people that, hey, your laws suck, ours are better, here they are, that's a civilizing mission. So that's what Russia, for example, does when it comes to Georgia, my homeland. They look at the system that Georgians had and said, well, this is archaic, this is too old, this is feudal, this is medieval, this is not good. Let us give you ours, which we believe are better. Okay? The British do the same thing in India, for example, when they go and conquer Indian subcontinent, right? They increasingly create a system that is run by the British, right? With the British laws, British customs, British traditions, British law, right? And so that is, again, a civilizing mission. Later on in Africa, right? Same, all these European powers from Belgium to France, to Britain, to Germany, when they go and conquer parts of Africa, they all engage both in territorial aggrandizement, but also in civilizing mission, because they generally believe that their way is better. It is based on this racial stereotype. It is based on racism, right? Both ethnic and race-based racism. But that's kind of the core, one of the core beliefs they had at the time.
Wow, I was expecting you to say just money. I was not expecting the two reasons.
Money is a part of power, right? It's part of resources, not just the cash that you need, right? Because you can have, if you control territory with a lot of agricultural land, you can turn that into money by growing produce and selling it. If you have a lot of land with timber, you can cut down the trees and sell timber and build your ships, or sell timber and build something else. So territory is is one of the ways to raise funds, right? Through taxation, through trade, through resource exploitation. But to me, that is fundamentally is more about the power that territory control gives you, but also about the culture, right? The culture should justify this. And in every European case, the culture was that justified the territorial conquest, especially of lands outside Europe, outside your land, through this perception of civilizing mission.
If you can expand more of how they got cash out of wars, because you mentioned a lot of interesting things, that would be amazing.
Well, in order to fund all these wars, you need a lot of money, right? And especially if you live in the United States nowadays, we know how expensive the war is. We've been engaged in the conflict for over 2 decades and cost us trillions of dollars, right? So that's any American, right, who's lived in the past 20 years should know that. So there are different ways you can raise funds. Probably the most famous one, the one that everyone kind of thinks of, is taxes. Right? You make your citizens pay taxes and then raise that revenue and use it for whatever reasons, including the war. But the taxation system in this early period, right, before 19th century, is quite archaic. It's quite inefficient. Oftentimes, state actually outsourced taxes, like in France, for example. The state outsourced taxes to private companies called general farms that farmed taxes. Right, they would give a chunk of money to the state in advance, and then they will go and kind of collect money from the people to make sure that they get their money's worth. So it's quite inefficient. It's certainly exploited. So one of the ways revolution did is that it made sure that privileges that nobles or other groups of people had, those privileges were destroyed. And then create a system of progressive taxation where the more you earn, the higher the tax rate that you are paying. So that is a kind of modern concept of it, right? So we are not going to tax a person who is earning $30,000 the same way as $200,000. Although, to spoil the story, we know that those on top find loopholes to pay less taxes. We know that, right? But that's a different story. It's a loophole, about the legal kind of loophole, exploiting the system. So one is a taxation. And Napoleon is very good in terms of reorganizing tax system and creating an efficient tax extraction where taxes are clear and there's a system to back them up, right? The government will come and hunt you down and find a way to get its money. Again, not necessarily a good thing, right? If you are not supportive of a large state, right? If you are not keen on paying taxes, this is not necessarily a good thing, but that's the development. Another way is to engage in trade, in developing economy, in investing heavily in economy, and promoting trade. And again, we also see Revolution Napoleon doing this. This is, for example, done through developing of infrastructure. Napoleon leaves behind a robust infrastructure. If you're ever in Paris, you can still go and see the canals that he built, the roads that he built, the bridges that he built, right? These are all done to promote both trade within France, right? And then trade between France and the rest of Europe. Because the more the trade grows, the bigger will be the tax base that you can tap. Another one, and this is where it gets really interesting, is that whenever you occupy territory of another state or another region, you can use that as both for tax extraction, but also for exploitation in terms of resources, right? So Napoleon, for example, when he goes to Italy in 1796 during Revolution, right, during Revolutionary Wars, he actually pillages Italy. He extracts enormous sums. What would it be today? Hundreds of $millions of worth of money is extracted forcibly from Italian cities, from Italian provinces, and then shipped back home in order to balance and stabilize French economy. So that's a war exploitation, right? Or, for example, when he defeats Prussia in 1806, he forces Prussian state to pay war indemnity, kind of compensation also hundreds of millions in the compensation, where, to borrow that ancient Roman expression, woe to the vanquished, right? If you lose the war, there's a consequence for it. And the consequence is that the victor will tell you what to do and how to do it. In this case, it's the money that Napoleon is after. So, multiple avenues of extracting resources. And maybe I'll mention one more, and that is you can go and get loans. There are enormous and massive banking houses in Europe. Think about Baring Bank in England, Hope Bank in Amsterdam, or the Swiss banks, right? And you can go and actually get the loans from these banks, just like states do today. They get loans from International Monetary Fund, or they get loans from one of the big banking corporations, and then pay back with interest.
I will say something probably naive, and I'm sorry in advance for the listeners. I'm just a young person that is trying to understand the world. But all these wars and all these people getting killed, but all these countries kind of emerging together because they coexist, that was a huge benefit to the world, isn't it? Right. No.
That's a complex question, whether that's necessarily to the benefit, because there are consequences of those wars that we still live with. So one thing that I think your listeners should remember, that history is never dead, right? We live with the consequences of those decisions still 200 years, 300 years later. So one of the things, for example, right, this is the period, this revolutionary era that I study, is the period when Poland was erased from the map of Europe. Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is destroyed in 1795 through the combined efforts of Russia, Austria, and Prussia. If you ask Poles, is that a good thing? Is it a good thing for Europe as a whole? Because it will take whole century, more than a century, until 1919 before Poland is revived again. And even then, it only survives for 20 years to be destroyed and partitioned yet again by Russia or Soviet Union at the time and Germany, right? So there is a long-term consequence for this. Or here's another one. Napoleon taking over the Holy Roman Empire, that medieval kind of construct of over 300 states, German states, right? And then reducing them to only 3 dozen. Well, that's the first step towards German unification. But you can argue that German unification is not necessarily a good thing, because that first step leads to ultimately to creation of united Germany. And we know the consequences of that, right? We have a turbulent first half of the 20th century, and Germany plays a crucial role in all of this. So again, it's not about necessarily passing a moral judgment that I'm interested in, but rather assessing what happened and what are why things happened, and then what are the repercussions, long-term repercussions. So I always tell my students that there are 5 questions that you usually ask about history, right? Who, what, where, when, and why. And of all these 5, why should be the one that you should care the most. Because nowadays with phones, with AI, you can easily find information about who, what, and where. You can simply ask Siri or Alexa, when this happened, and she will tell you right away. But why is a very powerful question, because it asks you to analyze, to connect the dots that may not be visibly, kind of openly connectable. Right? It asks you to dig deeper in behind the historical questions, to look for the reasons for why things are the way they are today. I mean, look at the current conflict in Ukraine. Right? This is not the conflict that began a year ago. Right? The rivalry between Russia and Ukraine is decades old. In fact, you can go back all the way to the medieval era, and then certainly look at the events in 1650s, for example. Right? So those decisions, right, have reasons for them, and those decisions then also have repercussions. And even when we are removed from the decisions for hundreds of years, they still live with us. There are still consequences.
So you are basically saying that what I'm saying is irrelevant. If the word is better or worse or whatever it is, the real question is why it happened, how it happened.
I think that, to me, that's the most important question you should ask, because it makes you analytical, right? It asks you to be more skeptical of what the government tells you, right? It makes you more skeptical about listening to traditional explanations, because we know that every country has national myths, irrespective of what country you take. Greece, Georgia, United States, they all have national myth. And those myths are designed to extol and eulogize the nation at somebody else's expense. Well, it is one thing to listen to that, and it's a different thing to look with an open eye, open mind, critical mind, and see behind that veil. Right? And history, when properly done, allows us to do that.
Why you have so much passion about history?
Because it is about human experience. It always boggles my mind when my students come and tell me that history is boring, because it's anything but. It is sometimes taught in a boring fashion. Right? Whenever a teacher asks you to memorize dates or numbers or memorize just facts, that's usually the turnoff. But if you approach history how it should be approached from the point of view of a human experience, then it cannot be boring. It's absolutely not boring, because humans have a remarkable ability to engage in diversity of activities. They have this diversity of emotions, diversity of reasons why they do things. But at the same time, this is one of the most remarkable things about history, is that if there is one thing that doesn't change through the history, and that is the human nature. That is why we can read the ancient Greek writers. Right? We can read Thucydides. We can read his Peloponnesian War and see that the decision that they're making, what he describes, how humans function, right? How human nature is driven, are exactly same as today. So that's where my hope is, that even though history never exactly repeats itself, there are certain themes, certain circumstances that repeat. And if we learn history, we should be able to identify those cycles, those themes, those currents taking place in present day, and do something about it. Right? If we know, for example, about historical context, about the currents, about the themes that shaped post-World War I Germany, that allowed the rise of totalitarian regime in Nazi Germany, we should be able to identify similar movements taking place today and do something about it before it is too late.
I hated history at school, obviously, like everybody else.
You maybe had a bad teacher, I don't know.
Yes, but slowly, I started listening, understanding philosophy, science, and all this stuff. And I actually believe history is that topic that can teach me the most about everything, about business, about human relationship, and it's so like, for example, now in comparison to start listening a business book, I prefer to listen history, because I will get more lessons for business from history.
Well, I'm glad to hear. I'm glad to hear. Welcome to the club, brother. No, of course, as a historian, I agree wholeheartedly for it. I started my career as a lawyer, and then halfway through it, I decided to switch and become a historian, because there is certainly that universality of history, the universality of human emotion, where I can read about Chinese history and see the same human nature at play. You can read about, history of Japan, history of the Mongol, history of African societies, and see certain universality of human emotions, human responses, and then learn from that, right? Learn how to adjust, what to expect, and what to do. And in your case, you're very successful at your line of work, and you can read, for example, business history and see how Medici's do it. For example, one of my projects that I'm working on is a new book about kind of how a group of French bankers, right, subsidized all these wars. So it allows me to both do history, but also to understand the beginnings of the modern banking system, the modern way of interaction between the banks and the state. So you're absolutely right. It depends on what your interests are in terms of what aspect of human experience you're interested, but history will have an answer for it.
So I have a very hard question for you.
All right.
Are you ready?
Okay.
And it's about the war now in Russia and Ukraine.
All right.
So what are your thoughts about historically how did this happen?
How it happened or why it happened?
Why it happened? As you teach us before, it's better to ask why.
All right. That's right. No, this is it's a long history. It's a history that stretches back generations, and it's not anyone who is from Eastern Europe, especially from the former Soviet bloc. And if you talk to them, they would be first to tell you that they were not surprised by it. Certainly, as a Georgian, I was not surprised by it because Georgia was on the receiving end of Russian imperialism for past decades. We fought wars against Russians, most famously in 2008. And of course, Ukrainians in 2008 were already talking about an impending war between Russia and Ukraine. So this modern round, because this is not something new, but this modern round of conflict between Russia and Ukraine starts in 2014. Right? But it starts because of that nostalgia, imperial nostalgia that you see in the Russian government. Right? This is a part and parcel of that imperial project that the Russian government has been engaged ever since Putin's rise to power. Right? Connecting to what we've discussed, this is about the power, it's about the prestige, it's about the international standing. It's about making Russia great again, to borrow a more Trumpian phrase. And in order to do that, you need to reclaim territories that you believe, right? If you are from Putin, or if you are of his mindset, you need to reclaim the territories that you believe were part of your imperial domain. So, to me, it's a historical perspective that provides us a wider context for this current round of fighting. If you read the article that Putin, for example, wrote, 2 years ago, or last year, I guess last summer, maybe, denying the existence of a Ukrainian nation, right, justifying the Russian imperial claims to Ukraine. This is a good example of how history can be twisted, how it can be exploited for political needs. But in order to respond to it, in order to see through what he's trying to do, you must study history. You must understand far deeper roots of Ukrainian nationhood. You have to go back to, for example, struggle between Ukraine and Russia in 17th century. You can look at the struggle between Ukrainians and Russians in 19th century when Russians were determined to erase Ukrainian language. Or the fighting between Ukrainians and Russians at the beginning of the 20th century when Ukraine did get away from Russia after World War I and was forcibly reincorporated into this new reiteration of Russian Empire, Soviet Union. So there is a long background context to this fighting. Needless to say, as a Georgian, as a person who've lived through the harsh 90s, As a person who's been to Ukraine and has a lot of Ukrainian friends, I'm firmly in favor of Ukraine and staunchly pro-Ukrainian. So I probably should mention that right away. That I wish them all the best and can't wait to celebrate their victory.
Interesting. I want to. You never mentioned in all the conversation now about the U.S. in part of the. So you believe that this is strictly a Russian thing that is happening? Is not like is not involved. The United States is not involved.
No, the United States is involved because it supports Ukraine. Sure, United States is involved because it has maintained the most successful military alliance in human history. The one that ensured that there is no state-on-state action amongst the Allied members since 1940s, right? NATO is an important element in this story, but not for the reasons that, for example, Russians argue. Right? Russian narrative is that NATO expansion was driven by American needs. That is not true. I've served in the Georgian diplomatic corps. I've been on the other side, and I know why Georgians wanted to join NATO and why they still want to join NATO. And it is not because Americans pushed them or beat them or forced them to do it, but it's because we were and we still are fearful of Russia. That's why the Baltic states joined NATO, and that's why they have not been invaded. That's why Ukraine wanted to join NATO, and if NATO had made a decision, and if the Americans had made a decision in 2008 in Bucharest to accept Ukraine and Georgia, there would have been no war in 2008 or 14 or 22. Okay, so no one forces these nations. None. Neither Poland, no Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, no one forced them to join this American-led alliance. But they joined it because they understood the benefits of it. And the benefits are clear. Protection from Russia. I mean, I've been saying that in early 2000s, that we need protection from Russia, and I've been laughed at by saying that Russia is not going to go to invade any of these countries. But we've seen that that's not true.
First of all, I'm asking out of pure interest to challenge my thoughts, because
Sure.
for me, it's like, what is the story that I believed? I'm open that I'm wrong. Is that probably is United States threatening with NATO expansion Russia, and this is a defense of Russia to start on their hide, or like to prevent this from happening in the future as well. It was the right timing with Biden in the I don't know. So this is what I believe out of my so I'm curious to hear like a bit more deep your thoughts about that now that I told you my thoughts.
Well, I think I partially already responded to it. Again, ask yourself why these countries, the countries that joined since 97, why they joined NATO. Right? What are the reasons for it? And it's not because Americans beat them to join it. It's not because Americans forced them to join it. Right? These are initiatives coming from all these individual countries. So what's behind their thinking? And the answer is clear. It's fear of Russia. It's fear of what Russians are capable of doing vis-a-vis these countries.
Maybe not fear of America, because they are the most powerful and they want to join them. They are the most powerful country in the world, and
but
they want to
Americans
join
Americans don't need these countries in the military alliance. There is no need for Lithuania to be part of a NATO from American point of view. If we talk about American imperialism, you're going to talk about American imperialism not in the sense of military, but economic. American imperial power is not necessarily military, it's economic. Think about the dominance that Americans exercise through economic means. And for that matter, do you really think that Lithuanians or Georgians or, I don't know, Poles really can compete with the United States in terms of economy? No. In each of these cases, the decision to pursue integration in NATO is done because of the fear of what will the neighbors to the east will do. That's to me, it's pretty clear.
Okay, I'm open that I'm wrong, and I will do a bit more research on what you are saying to understand a bit more the situation. But the statistics, as I understand now, is like 400,000 Ukrainians died so far in the war, and around 100,000 Russians died in the war. How do you see this conflict continuing from now on? And
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. The war exerted great toll on both sides, but you gotta ask yourself why these people died, right? Because this war can end tomorrow with the Russian decision to withdraw. That's it. There is no complicated answer to that. Russia is at fault for invading a sovereign nation. Russia is at fault for seeking to challenge the established international borders of a sovereign state. Putin can tomorrow recall the army and the war will end. It's not Ukrainians who are seeking Russian territory.
Also the same on the United States part. They can decide that enough of dying as well and let's not fund the war of Ukraine, and maybe that will end as well, but with Russia as the winner. So
let's assume that. Okay, let's assume that Americans stop the aid to Ukraine, and we have a Russian victory. What do you envision that? How that will play out? What will happen after that?
Probably Russia will get a lot of chunk of Ukrainian territory and rule that part as Russia.
And you're comfortable with that?
No, I'm not saying that I'm comfortable. I'm saying that this is probably what will happen. If that is the case.
That's where I'm saying is that from a moral point of view, how can you leave a nation that has been invaded and victimized by an imperial power? How can you just leave it? Isn't it your moral obligation to extend a helping hand with money, with help for the refugees or military needs? Well, so I don't see how you can argue that Americans need to stop supporting the war when what they are doing is extending a help to a nation that is defending itself against a foreign aggression. Once again, Ukrainians did not open this war, did not start this war, they did not invade Russian territory, nor did they seek to grab any piece of Russian land. So as long as they're defending themselves, I think we should be supporting them.
Okay, but you agree with me, there is two scenarios, or to end this war, or Russia stops, or United States leaves.
Yeah, but I don't see, this is the thing.
Because it's in expense of people, like 400,000 Ukrainians and people are dying. So we need to stop this immediately. Yeah. For me, it's like, I don't really care how we're going to stop it. Just let's stop it and deal with the other stuff later. I'm not sure if you
don't care how, then why wouldn't you argue that it would be easier simply for a president of the Russian Federation to make a decision to recall his troops? Isn't that easier? Why are you giving him what he wants and not to 60 million Ukrainians what they want?
But
where's the agency so where do you leave the choice for the Ukrainian people? Or you don't believe that the people should have a choice?
But I think you are You are probably, by the way, again, I want to rephrase that. I'm not the expert. I'm just sharing my beliefs.
No, it's not. I'm not expert on the Russo-Ukrainian War either, but we are here, I think, discussing, right? So you raised the question, and I'm trying to understand the rationale behind that question.
Yeah. So I think you are a bit romantic about the people, the Ukrainians, which I want the war to stop as well. So I want just this to stop immediately, in no matter what the consequence is, because the expense of this continuing, it will be is worse, in my opinion, that this continue, but that this stopping with the consequences. And I think that's probably maybe the easier solution, because I don't see in my mind that Russia will stop. And I'm not pro-Russia, not pro-Ukrainian. I'm like a person which I want war to stop immediately.
No, without realizing what you are doing is you're parroting Russian narrative, because what you are arguing that it is easier for you to accept the surrender of a Ukrainian nation rather than Russian president making a decision to end the war. And I simply fundamentally disagree with it, because the relationship between these two countries has been marked by significant problems in the past. Right? Let's not forget the 1930s experience of Ukrainians, the death of millions as a result of the policies that were created this devastating famine in Ukraine. Let's not forget the memory of what Russian imperialism meant for Ukrainian people. Let's not forget what Ukrainians went in this first year of the war, with mass murders of entire communities, torture in the occupied territories. And so I cannot envision a scenario where I can come out and say, you know what, Ukrainians, ignore all of that, surrender, and let the Russians decide your fate. Never. Again, it's much easier to end the war if certain people make decision to recall their troops rather than to forsake the future and the sovereignty of a nation. How can you accept that you essentially are arguing that Russia's insistence that Ukraine, and sovereign nation, independent nation, is not allowed to democratically decide to pursue its own fate. If Ukraine decides that it wants to be a member of the European Union, if Ukrainian people decide they want to join NATO, who the hell asks Russians? This will be like me telling you not to go to a certain restaurant, not to color your hairs any color you want. Wouldn't you tell me to screw off?
Well, we both agree, I think, in everything that you said, but I'm hopeless of any other solution. I don't want people to continue dying increasingly more and more and more. And I want this to stop at whatever expense. And my solution is to let the Russian people win, because I don't see any other option here. And maybe call me crazy.
The option, I just lay out an option. That's for Ukraine to win and Russians to get out. That is a perfectly reasonable option.
But how in a straight mind can believe that 60 million people of a country will win Russia, which is one of the biggest military powers in the world now? So
not anymore. And you probably understand that not anymore. If we've learned anything from this war, is that Russia is actually a colossus with clay feet. That its army is woefully unprepared, woefully underfunded, woefully unprepared for the war of modern scale. I mean, you mentioned the numbers of Ukrainian losses, but you don't mention Russian losses. And there is a reason for it, because you are not either interested or aware of the losses, right?
I said 100,000 people died in the war, and to my understanding, less than that. as I know that did. But also to the other point, from my experience, I understood that Russia is becoming more powerful during the war now in comparison to
Give
what
me an
it
example
was.
of that. Give me an example of it.
I think the relationships with other countries of the
Like
Asia
what?
and all this stuff are strengthening, like probably China, India, all this stuff, and it's stop becoming dependent on the West, and it's becoming kind
Dependent
of
on China? Because by the end of this war, Russia will be a Chinese satellite state.
Meaning
That it will be entirely dependent on the goodwill of China. Dig deeper, my friend. Dig deeper. Russia could have shaped its future far differently from what played out. You probably are old enough to remember when Putin was expressing interest in Russia joining NATO in the early 2000s. Instead of seeking a closer integration, instead of seeking a closer relationship with the West, the decision was made to do the opposite. And now Russia will pay the consequences for it. Russian military will take a better part of a decade to recover from it. And even then, it will be nowhere near the capacity of the great powers. Russia, if you ask me, already is not a great power. It's a regional power. But its economy is in shambles. It's financially nowhere near China or Russia or even Britain. So I cannot share your optimistic view of it. Russia will be paying consequences for these decisions for decades to come.
So you're saying that there is hope for Ukraine to win Russia?
Of course there is a hope. Of course there is a hope. Strategically, Ukraine already won this war. There is
In what way?
no go back. There is no go back. It's
what
now
way?
the question is, what will be on the grounds the victory look like? But in a strategic level, on the level of grand strategy, Ukraine and Russia, that union, any possibility of that union is long gone.
But you mentioned that it strategically won the war, and I don't understand what you mean by that.
Well, how do you understand the term strategic? Let me kind of make sure that we're on the same page.
The word strategic, I don't know. That's why it's like it has hidden stuff, hidden motives. Their goal in a way.
Let me ask you. Strategic, the term itself is about identifying long-term aims or interests of a nation. So now compare where Ukraine was before the war and where it is now with regards to relationship with European Union, relationship with NATO, relationship with the United States. If nothing else, look at militarily where it was 2 years ago, largely a remnant of Soviet military system, to now where it is almost entirely transformed into a NATO-style military. Think about the relationship with European Union. Read The Economist, which had a wonderful breakdown of support that European Union, United States, and other countries are providing to Ukraine. The relationship is far closer now with European powers than it ever was before. That is something that Russia wanted to avoid. And instead, it actually pushed Ukraine into the embrace of European Union and NATO. So on a strategic level, as far as I'm concerned, Ukraine is in a better position today than it was 2 years ago, than it was 3 years ago, than it was 5 years ago.
Interesting.
Now
Very
we talk about operational, right? Now operationally, we'll see how things will turn out. whether this counteroffensive will succeed. What will be ultimately the decision made on the borders, right? I would love to see the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine restored. I would like to see all the Russian troops get out. But that is something that time will tell whether Ukrainians can achieve that.
Okay. As I understand, the only difference on our arguments is that you believe there is still hope for Ukraine to win the war and like restore all the military and all the one Ukraine like it was before. And I just don't see this happening as a realistic.
That's the fun part of having the right to have your opinion, right? That's fine. We can meet in a couple of years of time and see how things turned out.
Yes, which by the way, I want to say I love you, because this was so exciting to understand the other side and
Sure.
share all these thoughts. But I have one question that I ask all these guests in this podcast, which is not about Ukraine and Russia. Don't worry.
Hey, we already discussed.
but if I give you $1 trillion, how do you spend it in 2023 for maximum impact to do good in the world?
Wow, $1 trillion, not even billion. I don't know. That's a great question. I'm a man who lives within humble means. I'm fine with whatever I have. So I will certainly not buy McMansions and big cars or palaces or yachts. I'll establish probably an organization of some sorts that will give all of it away.
In what way?
Subsidizing science, subsidizing projects, supporting initiatives that benefit the people. Now, that will be all dependent on individual project. For example, I like what some people do here in the United States in terms of supporting education, where, for example, Jeff Bezos's wife, after the divorce, right, she received a significant share of the mutual property or mutual wealth. So she's giving away tens of millions of dollars to support education in the United States. I think that's a very worthwhile cause. And that would have been one of the things I would have pursued. For example, setting up scholarship, which I do already within my humble means. I've set up scholarship for students who don't have money to receive education. So having $1 trillion would be that I would be able to transform the lives of millions of people, just if nothing else, by providing them with the opportunity to seek education.
Education in the formal way that we know, universities and all this stuff? Part
of it, yeah. Including, yeah. I mean, if you have some other, I mean, not necessarily just university. I mean, I'm a big fan of vocational training, because we need.
Meaning, what is that?
Vocational training is, let's say welders, stonemason, people who are working in what we can describe as a blue collar, field. It's not just about specializing in history or art or French literature, but science, the vocational training. I would love to support. With $1 trillion, I would love to support that. I would love to support the environmental causes. I'm very passionate about that. I'm an avid hiker, and I spend with my children a lot of time in outside in the mountains or in the woods and on the rivers and lakes, and I would love for the children of my children to enjoy that too. So I would certainly devote significant resources to that. But as I said, if I had $1 trillion, I would give all of it away.
I'm curious as well to understand why you think the book about Napoleon had so much success. Looking back, what?
I don't know. It's your guess is as good as mine. I don't know. I didn't write it to be that successful, and I certainly didn't expect it. I just wanted to express what I felt and thought about this period, and for some reason, I still can't figure out why it became wildly successful.
How many books it sold? Do you know the current number?
Thousands of copies. I mean, it's translated into 6 languages, sold all around the world. So.
Yeah, and the audiobook is very good. We're going to put all your books in the link on the description. But guys, go and buy the audiobook is good.
Yeah, the guy who reads it is quite good.
This is outside the university. So you make money also by writing books as well, right? You have a lot of books, and why do you?
No, not really. Actually, let me kind of cut you off there. Making money in history books is not a good initiative unless you are a best-selling author.
You're Harari.
Yeah, that's right. When I grow up, I want to be like him. No, so none of my books is successful enough that I can simply quit my job. Although, one wonders if I was like you all and I sold millions of copies of my book, whether I would quit teaching, because teaching is something that I'm passionate about and I love interacting with students. But nonetheless, I've written a lot of books, but they're, it's not, they don't make that kind of money. So I write books because I'm passionate. I love doing it. No one forces me to get up at 6 o'clock every morning or go to bed at 2 o'clock every evening. I do it because I feel that there's something else that I have to say, something else I have to share with people who share the interest. So I know that most of my books are not necessarily of that popular appeal, but they're of appeal to people like me.
So do you find the motivation, like, for example, you are interested in a topic intrinsically and you're like, okay, I will write a book so I dig deeper into this field. Like, this is kind of the reason why you like.
None of my books were written because I wanted to make money. None. There was none that people simply, or publishers came to me and said, "Hey, write this book and we'll sell 1 million copies." No, all of these books started because I was interested in learning something new. The book that I mentioned, my new book that I'm writing on, the intersection between French finance and military and war. Again, I started it because I increasingly come to this greater appreciation of how important it is to understand the financial and economic history of any given society, to understand the political and military history of it. So it's for me, it's maturing as a historian, right? We all should aspire to grow on whatever trajectory we are to improve ourselves. And so each of the books that I wrote were designed or kind of helped me grow as a historian, helped me mature as a scholar. So that's why I do them.
And how do you research? Like you read Google, Wikipedia? Do you speak with other people? Like you watch YouTube videos?
No, I do all of that for fun. No, for research, I go to archives. So I almost every year I go overseas, depending on the subject that I'm working on. I go to a country and then go to archives. So this summer I was in France and I spent 6 weeks in the archive and I brought back about 17,000 pages of documents. So now I'm going to go through slowly and read all of that. Then I'll read simultaneously, I'll read everything that I can find on the subject so I can understand what has been said about this subject. Where are we as a field of history? And then as I do this, I'll come to certain conclusions, right, based on what I've found. So I'm not going into this field with any preconceived notions. So I'm not doing research to fit any theory or any notion that I already have, because I find it impossible to have something until you digest this mountain of material. So just to give you a sense, I don't know if your listeners can see. You see this stack here? That stack was just for, yes, that stack of books was just for an article that I wrote. So it's about maybe 2-3 dozen books. And that's only for about a 20-page article that I just finished and sent off. So the job of historian is to cast a vast net and to kind of like a fisherman, to bring that net in. And instead of fish, you'll have sources, you'll have documents. And it's impossible to properly write about history unless you go to the very source. And the source is to understand what people who were making decisions, who were living at that time, right, what they were doing. And the only place that has that is archives. Archives is the repository of all the documents that were made at the time. So I read memoirs, I read, the things that the people wrote after the event. But
and
humans.
And you can understand it on the language that they are.
Yes, of course. I mean, that comes with I think it comes with the territory. That's a fun part of history, that if you want to engage in history in the true sense of it, then you have to learn other languages. So, because that will broaden your horizons. So you should be able, if you are working in my area, you should be able to read in French, in English, in Spanish, in Russian, because in German, because these are 4 great or 5 great powers whose actions, whose decisions affect the future of the continent. So, and each of them, I always tell my students that history is, I don't know if you've played with a kaleidoscope. It's a tube, right? You look through it and you rotate it, and the pieces inside it move and they make different colors and shapes. Well, history to me is like this. But if you only know one language, that means like looking through a kaleidoscope with only white pieces. So it only gives you one vision of it. But if you know Russian, French, British, that means kaleidoscope has all these numerous parts, numerous colors, and the picture is vivid, right? It's more colorful. And that's, to me, how you appreciate history. So if you look at my book that I wrote on Napoleonic Wars, it has sources in more than half a dozen languages, because I thought that in order to understand what Russians were trying to do, you have to read Russian sources. What the French were doing, you have to understand French sources. Same applies for Spanish, for Germans, for British, for whoever. And that's, I think, all, people in my field, in history, those who are doing it the right way, they all do it this way.
Wow. So I heard one phrase that struck me you reminded me that you could never understand actually what happened back then 100%, because you have different context of your life now. So you cannot get really 100% in the shoes of the people that lived back then. But when you read those messages or those archives, is the closest you can get to them. So it must be a great experience.
It is, absolutely. And I do want to kind of point out one thing that maybe is obvious, but still worth mentioning, that history is a subjective experience, because every historian who writes on a particular subject has his or her particular interpretation, right? We can look at the same kind of pile of documents and come to different interpretations of it. That's where I think your point is important, that history is not necessarily recreating the past exactly how it was, because we were not there. We will not be able to revive every little detail of it. But history is about an interpretation of the set of facts. So, and if we as historians, as a professional group of people who do that for a living, come to an agreement on set of facts, then we can move and start analyzing a different set, right? So we can, for example, say that, Napoleon won in this battle on this day, and this is how we think it happened, right? And then once there is a consensus on it, then the next generation of historians will come along and will say, well, that is agreed upon. Let's go and do something else. Now, it is oftentimes happens that a group of historians look at a set of facts, come to a certain agreement, but the next generation looks at it and says, you know what? This interpretation is completely incorrect. And then offers its interpretation. So French Revolution is a good example of it. Because if you examine the historiography, that is the study of how it was interpreted, you see these waves and cycles of different people trying to interpret revolution to reflect their own political agendas. So that's, I think, one of the both interesting things about history, but also dangerous things, because history oftentimes is a reflection, subjective reflection of a person who writes it.
I have another 2 questions.
All right.
So the second to last question is, what you want to leave behind in this world?
What I want to leave behind? I want to leave behind my children, who I want them to be successful in whatever they decide to pursue. I want to leave behind a world where people are doing better than they are today. So I know it's more a utopian desire, but I know that my books maybe will last a generation or two, but then there will be another historian who will build upon them and write better books than this. So I'm not hopeful for my books beyond a generation or two, but I'm hopeful for humanity to build a better place, to be able to escape the dangers of climate change, the dangers of wars, the dangers of of famines, and to create a better place for my children, for the children of their children, for your children, right? So that's my kind of big aspiration.
And the last one, this is an exercise that we do every time on the podcast. In the end, we end it. We are pretending that this is your last 30 seconds in this planet and you're going to die in 30 seconds. So leave a message that it will be broadcast to the world. This is the last 30 seconds.
Hold on a second. Am I dying violently? Somebody kills me, or I'm just dying of old age?
I don't know. You decide. But
no, that's different things, my friend. If I'm dying peacefully, I want a glass of port. I want a nice sunset and a good porch, and die quietly. I'm not big on speeches. But if somebody is trying to kill me violently, I'll land it on maybe with a shout of freedom and resistance. Live your dreams. That's what I'll say. So that people remember it. Live your dreams. We only have one chance. So pursue your better self and live and pursue your dreams.
Okay. I love you. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for watching, guys, to the end.
Thank you.